He left the notes where she would be sure to find them, tucked into the pages of a book she was reading, slipped between the cushions of her favorite chair, folded into a drawer she opened every morning, little handwritten lists in his elegant hand of the things he despised about her. 20 Reasons Why I Hate You, one was titled. You look like a Jewish manicurist, said another. The man who wrote them was Antony Armstrong-Jones, Lord Snowdon, the brilliant, beautiful, ferociously charming society photographer who had married Princess Margaret in 1960 in a wedding watched by 300 million people. To the world, they were the most glamorous couple in Britain. Behind the doors of Kensington Palace, he was conducting a slow surgical campaign to destroy her. The affairs with women and with men, the public cruelties, the private notes, the deliberate erosion of a woman who had already given up the love of her life to keep her place in the family. Margaret could be difficult. Margaret could be impossible. But what Snowdon did to her was something else entirely. It was a project, and the palace, as it always did, covered every word of it. One detail in that opening deserves a careful hand, because the record is not as fixed as the cruelty. The lists are real. The practice is real. It is attested by the people who stood closest to her, but the exact wording has come down to us through her biographers, decades later, not through any contemporaneous transcript. Anne de Courcy, whose 2008 work, Snowdon, the biography drew on the cooperation of Snowdon himself and of Margaret's own household, renders the list as 20 Reasons Why I Hate You. Other accounts, including Craig Brown's 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, render it 24. The count varies. What does not vary is the method. So let us be precise about what is documented and careful about what is merely repeated, because the difference is the whole point of telling this story properly. Here is what is documented. Anne Glenconner was Margaret's lady-in-waiting from 1971 until the princess died. She was in the rooms, and in her 2019 memoir, Lady-in-Waiting, she set down a small domestic fact that tells you everything about the atmosphere inside that marriage. Margaret, she wrote, had stopped opening her own chest of drawers. She had her maid do it instead, because Tony, that was what everyone called him, had developed a habit of leaving nasty little notes inside. Think about what that means as a daily ritual. A grown woman, a princess, the sister of the queen, no longer able to open a drawer in her own home without bracing for a sentence designed to wound her. Glenconner did not soften it. Snowdon, she said, was spiteful in creative ways, and he liked writing vile little one-liners, which he hid in her glove drawer, or among her hankies, or tucked into her books. The cruelty was not a temper, it was a craft. And notice the choice of weapon, because it is not the obvious one. A jealous spouse screams. A bitter one storms out. Snowdon did neither, at least not where it would have spent the cruelty cheaply. In a moment that passed, he wrote. He committed the contempt to paper, in handwriting he knew she would recognize, and then he placed it somewhere private and waited. The aggression was time-released. It would find her hours later, alone, with no audience to perform composure for and no one to share the blow with. There is something almost architectural about it, a structure built to deliver pain on a delay, designed by a man whose entire profession was the careful arrangement of a frame. The notes that survive in the record are only the ones that were spoken of afterward. We have no idea how many there were. We only know that she came to fear her own furniture, and that the fear was rational, and that he had engineered it on purpose, one small folded sentence at a time. There is one more thing the witnesses are careful to add, and it matters because it keeps this honest. The Jewish manicurist line is recorded by more than one biographer, attributed by Sarah Bradford and echoed by Glenconner. But the texts of these notes reach us secondhand, repeated by friends, set down in memoirs years after the fact, polished a little, perhaps, in the retelling. What is solid is not the punctuation of any single note. What is solid is the practice, corroborated independently by the woman who attended Margaret daily and by the biographer to whom Snowdon himself spoke. The habit is real. The wording is reconstructed, Hold both of those truths at once because a story this damning is only as strong as its honesty about its own sources. But here is what the official record leaves out. To understand why the notes landed the way they did, you have to understand who wrote them and who he was before Margaret ever knew his name, because Antony Armstrong-Jones was not some unsuitable nobody the palace had failed to vet. He was the most interesting man in the room, any room, and that was exactly the trouble. He was born in March 1930 in Belgravia, the son of a Welsh barrister and a celebrated society beauty, Anne Massell. His uncle was Oliver Massell, the great stage designer. The artistic, theatrical world ran in his blood. At 16, he contracted polio while on holiday in Wales and spent 6 months in a Liverpool hospital. The illness left him with a withered left leg, an inch shorter than the other, and a slight permanent limp he would carry all his life. People who knew him said the limp made him work harder at everything, at charm, at seduction, at the relentless project of being the most magnetic person present. He went to Eton, then to Cambridge to read architecture, where he failed his second-year exams but found time to cox the winning Cambridge boat in the 1950 boat race. He could not be bothered with the degree. He could be bothered with winning. What he became, instead of an architect, was one of the finest photographers Britain has ever produced. He apprenticed under a society photographer known simply as Baron, and he had the eye, the genuine, undeniable eye. By his 30s, his portraits were in every glossy magazine in the country, and today more than 280 of his photographs hang in the permanent collection of the National Portrait Gallery. Remember that number, because it is going to matter at the end of this story. The man had real gifts. That is precisely what made him dangerous. A cruel man with no talent is merely unpleasant. A cruel man with genius is something you forgive and keep forgiving. And the world did. He came from a world the palace barely understood, a bohemian, fluid, café society demi-monde, where the ordinary rules did not apply, where his appetites, for women and for men alike, were an open secret among those who moved in it. And let us be clear about something now, before we go a step further, because it is the easiest mistake in this entire story to make. His attraction to men was not the cruelty. His orientation is not the crime here, and anyone who tells it that way is telling it wrong and dating themselves in the process. The cruelty was the campaign, the notes, the humiliations, the calculated dismantling of his wife's confidence. The affairs matter only because of how he conducted them. In plain sight, designed to wound. Keep those two things separate. He did. It is worth pausing on the charm itself, because the charm is not a footnote to the cruelty. It is the same instrument. The men and women who knew Snowdon in his prime described a person who could make you feel, for the length of a conversation, like the only interesting human being alive. That gift is a kind of power. It draws people in, opens them up, teaches them to want his approval. And a man who has spent his whole life learning precisely how to make someone feel chosen has, by the same training, learned exactly how to make them feel discarded. The two skills are one skill, viewed from opposite sides. The talent that put strangers at ease in front of his lens was the same talent that found, with unerring accuracy, the one word that would unsettle his wife at breakfast. Charisma and cruelty in him were not opposites. They were the front and the back of the same coin, and he could turn it over at will. And then there was Margaret, who walked into his frame at exactly the moment she was most breakable. She had loved Peter Townsend, the divorced equerry, 16 years her senior, and she had given him up in 1955 under the combined weight of church, government, and family. The truth was quieter and colder than the public knew. She met Armstrong-Jones at a supper party in 1958, and the affair began some months later when he was commissioned to photograph her. By the autumn of 1959 they were engaged, and the timing tells you something. She is said to have accepted him a day after learning that Townsend, the man she had sacrificed everything to keep her place beside the throne, intended to marry a young Belgian woman who, by several accounts, greatly resembled Margaret herself. She came to Snowdon on the rebound, wounded. looking for a man who would make her feel chosen. He was very, very good at making people feel chosen. It was the first thing he did, and the first thing he withdrew. They married on the 6th of May, 1960 at Westminster Abbey, the first royal wedding ever broadcast on television, watched by an estimated 300 million people around the world. He was created Earl of Snowdon the following year. They had 2 children, David, born in 1961, and Sarah, born in 1964. And the family had approved him. The Queen Mother, the household, they had looked at this charming, gifted commoner and decided he was safe, that he was the modern, glamorous answer to the Townsend embarrassment. They were wrong in a way that would take years to surface, and consider the bitterness folded into that approval, because it is the engine of the whole tragedy. 5 years earlier, the same family had stood between Margaret and Peter Townsend and made it impossible. He was divorced, the church would not have it, the government would not have it, and a young princess was made to understand that her duty and her affections could not both survive, and that duty would win. She had bowed to that. She had given up the one man she was sure of. And then, having broken her of the love she wanted, the family blessed the love she could get, a man they barely knew, from a world they did not understand, on the strength of his charm and a photograph. They vetted Townsend's character to destruction and waved Snowdon through on his manners. It is one of the quiet ironies of her life that the institution which sacrificed her happiness for the sake of respectability handed her, with relief, to a man who would prove far more dangerous than a divorced equerry ever could have been. The thing they feared in Townsend was scandal. The thing they should have feared in Snowdon was already inside the door, because here is the part the wedding photographs could never show. 3 weeks into the honeymoon, a child was born in London, Polly Fry, the daughter of Camilla Fry, the wife of one of Snowdon's closest friends. She had been conceived while he was engaged to the princess. Before the marriage was even consummated, in other words, the betrayals were already in the post. This was not a good man who went bad. This was a pattern that simply continued, with the princess now standing in its path. Sit with the sequence for a moment because it tells you that nothing that followed was a reaction to her. The conventional story of a sour marriage runs the other way. She was difficult. He grew cold. They wounded each other. It curdled. But the child conceived during the engagement breaks that story before it can start. Whatever Margaret did later, whatever her temper cost the marriage, she did not cause the first betrayal, because the first betrayal predates the vows. He arrived at Westminster Abbey already unfaithful, already living by the rule that a friend would later hand to his biographer in 5 flat words. So, when people say the marriage destroyed them both, they are right, but they are not saying enough. The marriage did not create the man. The man brought himself, fully formed, into the marriage, and the marriage merely gave him a target who could not leave, could not divorce easily, could not even, for the longest time, be publicly believed. So the marriage descended, and it descended on both sides. And that honesty matters, because the easy version of this story is a saint and a monster, and the easy version is false. Margaret was no martyr. By 1966, she had begun an affair of her own with Anthony Barton, a Bordeaux wine producer who happened to be her daughter's godfather. A year later came a brief, intense liaison with Robin Douglas Home, a nephew of a former prime minister. He was a fragile man, and he took his own life some 18 months after they parted. Margaret had a temper that could clear a room. She could be imperious, demanding, impossible. The people closest to her did not pretend otherwise. Glenn Connor, who loved her, described the marriage in its worst years as 2 people trading insults like gunfire. But here is the asymmetry that the gunfire image conceals. They were both firing, yet only one of them was keeping a ledger. Snowdon's affairs were a battlefield of their own. A long-running relationship with a journalist, a mistress named Anne Hills, a liaison with Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs. A friend of his summed it up to Anne de Courcy in a single brutal sentence that the biographer recorded, "If it moves, he'll have it." Margaret's infidelities were the lonely lunges of an unhappy woman. His were a way of life, and increasingly, a weapon. He would conduct them where she would see. He would refuse to speak to her for days, even with the children in the room. He worked late, deliberately, endlessly, at the Sunday Times, and came home with a coldness he had clearly composed on the way. And then there were the notes. This is where the deliberateness becomes undeniable, and where the story earns its title. A man who shouts is out of control. A man who sits down with a pen in his beautiful architect's hand and writes a numbered list of the reasons he hates his wife, and then walks to her drawer and hides it among her handkerchiefs so that she will open it alone. That man is in complete control. That is not passion. That is composition. He was, by training and by temperament, an artist of the carefully arranged image, and he turned that same patience on the project of unmaking her. The note in the glove drawer, the line tucked into the bedside book that said, simply, "I hate you." The list. Whether it numbered 20 reasons or 24, it was meant to be found, meant to be read in solitude, meant to do its work when no one was watching and no one could comfort her. The audience that finds Margaret's wit so magnetic, the woman who, asked how the Queen was keeping, is famously said to have replied, "Which one? My sister, my mother, or my husband?" should sit for a moment with the other side of that wit. The same sharpness that delighted a dinner table was the sharpness he learned to use against her in private, because he knew exactly where it would cut. There is a detail in the geography of the cruelty that is easy to miss, and it sharpens everything. The young man on the beach in those 1976 photographs, Roddy Llewellyn, had come into Margaret's life through Mustique, the small Caribbean island where Colin Tennant, Lord Glenconner, had given her a plot of land and built her a house called Les Jolies Eaux, completed in 1972. It was the only home she ever truly owned. She met Llewellyn there in 1973. He was a landscape gardener, gentle and unthreatening, and by every account he made her, for a while, genuinely happy. Even the Queen, who is not remembered for her warmth toward Margaret's choices, is said to have thanked the Tennants afterward for the introduction, because Roddy had made her sister happy in a way the marriage never had. Hold that against the central charge. The relationship the world used to condemn her was, by the testimony of the family itself, the one kind thing in years. And it was the kind thing that the cameras chose to punish, and here is what the public never saw. While this was happening behind the doors of Kensington Palace, the institution did what the institution always does. It managed the spectacle. When the marriage finally, visibly broke, when photographs surfaced in early 1976 of Margaret on the beach at Mustique with Llewellyn, 17 years her junior, the machine did not protect the princess. It let her take the blow. On the 19th of March, 1976, a terse joint statement announced that the marriage had irretrievably broken down and would be formally ended. And then the country was invited to choose a villain, and it chose her. Watch how the asymmetry worked, because it is the real subject of this video. Labour members of Parliament rose to call her a royal parasite and a floozy. The press cast her as a predatory older woman and Llewellyn as her toy boy. The full weight of public contempt came down on the wife. Anne Snowdon, who had fathered a child before the marriage began, who had run a procession of affairs through its entire span, who had been hiding cruelties in her drawers for a decade, Snowdon's own conduct drew, in the words of the record, scant attention. As de Courcy put it with devastating economy, most people, including the royal family, took his side. That is the cover, not a shredded document or a locked vault, something quieter and more effective than that. The cover was the simple institutional instinct to let the difficult princess absorb the scandal, so that the charming Earl could keep his reputation intact. The class and cover machinery this audience already distrusts did not need to suppress the truth. It only needed to point the cameras the other way. The divorce came in 1978. The decree made final that July, the first divorce of a senior member of the royal family since 1901. Margaret never remarried. Snowdon married again before the year was out, and his life carried on with barely a scratch. And it is in that contrast, in the two paths that diverged after 1978, that the story delivers its verdict. Because look at what happened to each of them. Margaret's decline became the public legend. Mystique, the drinking, the cigarettes she was never quite able to give up, the partial removal of a lung in 1985, the slow narrowing of a life that had once been the most glamorous in Britain. It is the decline that everyone remembers, and it is worth saying plainly that even here the record is contested. She was diagnosed in the late 70s with alcoholic hepatitis, and the image of the gin-soaked princess hardened into legend. Yet Christopher Warwick, who wrote a careful biography with her cooperation, denied flatly that she was ever an alcoholic. The truth, as so often with Margaret, sits somewhere the legend has no patience for. A woman in real trouble, certainly, but also a woman flattened by a caricature that was easier to sell than to examine. What is not in dispute is the shape of the ending. From 1998, a series of strokes took her piece by piece. First her mobility, then her sight, then her voice. She died on the 9th of February 2002 in a London hospital, age 71, 3 days after the 50th anniversary of her father's death. The world filed her away as a cautionary tale, the princess who could not cope, the woman who had everything and wasted it. Almost no one, in the obituaries, asked the obvious question, coped with what? And Snowdon. Snowdon flourished. He kept the title. He kept the career. Those 280 photographs in the National Portrait Gallery only grew in number and esteem. He won Emmys for his films. He was made a life peer in his own right in 1999. He served as provost of the Royal College of Art. He was celebrated, late into his long life, as a campaigner for disabled people, and as one of the great photographers of his century. When he died in 2017 at 86, the obituaries called him an artist. They were not wrong about the talent. That was never the question. The question was always what he did with the patience that talent had taught him. And on that, the obituaries were largely conveniently silent. His private life after Margaret only confirmed the pattern for anyone who cared to look. He married again within the year, and that marriage too ran aground on infidelity. In 1998, another woman bore him a son, and the union with his second wife did not survive it. In 1997, a long affair surfaced, only because the woman involved had taken her own life. These are not the footnotes of a reformed man. They are the same life, continued, with the same disregard for the people inside it, and yet none of it dented the reputation. The portraits kept hanging, the honors kept coming. The obituarists, reaching for the easy word, reached for genius and charming and the photographer who married a princess, as though the princess were an item on his resume rather than a person he had spent 16 years dismantling. That is the final asymmetry, and it is the cruelest one, because it is the one history itself enforced. She became a verdict. He became a body of work. We should hold the line here exactly where the evidence holds it. This was a mutually destructive marriage. Both of them were unfaithful. Both of them could be cruel. Margaret was nobody's saint, and the biographers who admire her are careful to say so. The record is contested on individual details, the precise wording of the notes, the question of how heavily she drank, the exact temperature of any given scene. Those things are flagged, not resolved. But on the central asymmetry, the evidence is steady, and it is this. Of the two people firing in that marriage, one of them did it in the heat of unhappiness, and the other did it with a pen, a plan, and the patience of a man composing a portrait. The deliberation was his, and the institution that had once forced her to give up the man she loved then stood back and let the world blame her for the wreckage of the marriage it had blessed. That is the story the photographs could never show, and the obituaries chose not to tell. The notes in the drawer were not the symptom of a marriage gone wrong. They were a man, alone with a pen, deciding exactly how to break someone, and trusting, correctly, that no one would ever make him answer for it. Princess Margaret gave up the man she loved to keep her place in a family that then watched her marry a man who tortured her for sport. Antony Armstrong-Jones left her notes cataloging his contempt, paraded his affairs, and dismantled her in private with the patience of an artist composing a portrait. And when the marriage finally collapsed, the world blamed her. He kept his title, his career, and his reputation as a genius. She kept the wreckage. History remembers Margaret as the cautionary tale of a princess who couldn't cope. It rarely mentions the man who spent 16 years making sure she couldn't.